Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm James Leichter from Aptora. I appreciate you being here. Today's topic is going to be all about operation manuals, SOPs, standard operating procedures, policy, procedure, workflows, things like that. So I'm really excited to talk about this actually because I suppose it's not a topic for everybody. Not everybody likes writing. Not everybody likes creating policy manuals and SOP, but I like doing it. And probably one of the reasons I like doing it is because I like to be unnecessary. And that's really the goal here is you want to be unnecessary. If you own the company or you are the company rock star, one of your goals needs to be nice to have around, but not necessary to have around. Sure, it's great when you're there because you're the rock star and you can do things better than anybody else. But if you could get your methodology down on paper, then you would become less necessary. And that's what I like about creating policies, procedures, SOPs, things like that. With that in mind, I think I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to share my Word document with you, and we will talk about how to create policies, procedures, what I'll refer to mainly as just standard operating procedures. Before I show you some of the things that I recommend and I've created, I just want to give you an example of great SOP. At least corporate America considers McDonald's to have some of the best standard operating procedures there are. Certainly, if you know anything about Ray Kroc in the 50s, one thing he was famous for was perfecting the system of managing a McDonald's. He put everything in writing, everything went into documentation, and it was all carefully mapped out. So there was nothing left to chance. And today, if you've ever worked at McDonald's, then you know they have a system for everything. When you make a Big Mac, you don't just make it however you feel like making it. Maybe today you want to put 7 pickles on it. Yesterday you tried 4. It's not like that at all. You make that Big Mac exactly the same every time. Same with the fries. You apply the same amount of salt, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why McDonald's, while isn't great food, I mean, some of you may think it's great food. I personally don't think it's like great food, but I eat there a lot, especially when I travel, because you get the same thing every time. You can typically trust a McDonald's with few exceptions. You know what you're going to get because in part of their standard operating procedures. So let's talk about creating SOP. First of all, what is SOP? If you look at my document here, I think we'll just talk about the document and it'll probably help you think of ways to make your own. The document would start with document properties. You can see up here at the top, and it may be hard to read, it may be small on your screen, but what you're looking at is the document name, the location of the document, the revision number of the document, the author's name, the status, etc. Last saved by, last printed by, and the date. Those properties can automatically be added by Microsoft Word. If you were to click Insert and go to Quick Parts and select Field, and this isn't about Microsoft Word. I didn't want to make this about, a Word tutorial, but that is how I added those properties. Once those properties are added, then they update automatically. When I save the document, I print the document, when it's edited, etc., those things get updated. One of the most handy document properties you can have is the file path. How many people have asked you, where can I find a copy of this? You hand them a document, they want to do something with it. Where is this document? Sometimes documents get duplicated and we have multiple versions of the same document because we're sharing copies of a document. In this case, if you wanted somebody to edit it, they know exactly where to find it. No one should be allowed to download a local copy. They would all work on a copy that everybody is contributing to. If I forget to say it, it just came to my mind, you don't typically allow people to access an editable document when it comes to important policies and procedures. You typically make a PDF out of it. And the PDF can get passed around, can get emailed, etc. Whenever we update the document, then we would make another PDF, and you would just simply add to the name, append to the name, the version number of that if it's helpful. That way, without opening it, you would know that you had a later copy of that PDF than somebody else is offering you. All right, let's skip past the table of contents. And you know what? No, let's don't. Let me show you the table of contents real quick. That way you can see what's in here. In my SOP, and this is an SOP document, it's meant to be real, but it's also meant to be a teaching tool. In my SOP, after the document properties, we insert a table of contents, and we show header 1 and header 2 in the table of contents, and this allows us to quickly see what's in here, what's being offered. The first section that we're going to go over together is understanding the standard operating procedure. Then I have an example SOP, and that is the template that you would follow writing new SOPs. I have a standard operating procedure on ordering and receiving inventory. Now that SOP was written to use our software, but it would work just as well with QuickBooks, probably NetSuite, and many others. So if it works well with our program, it almost certainly will work well with QuickBooks with just a little bit of tweaking. So what you're going to hear today can be used with other programs. If I mention our software, it doesn't mean that none of this applies to you. It would apply to you if you're a QB user and a user of pretty much any kind of ERP or heavy accounting software program. So we have ordering and receiving inventory. Now, how did we pick these topics? You want to start with what's most important to run your company. The most important may not be at the top. They may be sorted alphabetically, but when you decide to start writing SOP, you're going to want to tackle the most important SOP there is. Now, in my opinion, it's all about getting money in the door. So if I were asked to write your SOP and you said, hey, James, write our SOP, start anywhere you want. And by the way, I don't need a job writing SOP. It's not that fun, okay? But if I work for you writing SOP, I would start with the phone rings. What do we do? When the phone rings, what do we do? How do we answer it? What do we say? Who do we send it to? What are the extension numbers, etc.? In that SOP, I would talk about demand service first. How do we schedule a demand service call? Because there's a lot of those coming in, right? So the SOP would be all about scheduling and booking demand service. That's getting it on the schedule, getting an agreement. We're going to be there tomorrow, 2 p.m. The next process is dispatching it. That is informing the technician who's been assigned to the work order that they have this particular work order, this demand service call to run. So that's the dispatching part. I'd write that out. How do we do it? Then I'd write out all the steps for the mobile user, so they know exactly how to create the work order and create an invoice and collect money. Then I would write SOP on how the office gets the money, because it could be cash, coin, check. Could also be a credit card that was processed. How do they deal with it? How do they create a bank deposit and get that money in the bank? If we can take care of that, then we can run our business for quite a while before we start having problems, because I'm sure you'd agree the most important thing is taking care of those demand calls, getting the money in the bank. Everything else will work out. After that, we have to think about ordering parts, materials, supplies. We have to think about scheduling and dispatching installation, and eventually everybody's going to want to be paid, right? So we'll have SOP for payroll. So here at the top, I have SOP for ordering and receiving inventory. How do we do it? SOP for receiving the items into inventory. So we talk about ordering it. Well, what happens when it's delivered or we go pick it up? How do we receive it? How do we enter that bill? How do we pay the bill? What's acceptable? How do we manage asset purchases? Like how do we manage purchasing a truck, and how do we set up loan amortization, depreciation, interest payments, etc.? How do we schedule and dispatch a demand service call? Managing a work order and creating an invoice from that work order in the mobile app. Managing sales leads. Now, again, these aren't in order necessarily, but managing sales leads would be up there near the top, wouldn't it? Probably after doing some of the things I just mentioned, I would want to write SOP for handling leads. When the phone rings and somebody says, how much do you charge for a furnace? How much are heat pumps? What do we do with that opportunity? What about ordering and receiving inventory? Progress billing, receiving customer payments and preparing the bank deposits, and it goes on. So let's go to our first section of our SOP guide and talk about the basics of SOP. First of all, it's really important to, let me make this a little bigger. It's really important to understand that we're not going for perfection. We don't want to try to perfect this because perfection is hard to attain and sometimes it's impossible. If you're a real perfectionist, it's impossible. You'll just never get to the point where it's perfect. So when we're writing policies and procedures and SOPs, I personally am not looking for excellent. I'm not looking for very good. I will take good enough, because a good enough SOP, well implemented now, beats an excellent SOP implemented someday, later, maybe never. And that happens a lot with companies. So it's best to just get something written and get it out the door and get it implemented as quickly as you can. What is an SOP, by the way? It's a step-by-step set of procedures on how to do something, like make that Big Mac, like run a service call, like answering the telephone. How do we answer the phone? There's a difference, though, between SOP and workflow and policies and procedures, and we'll talk about those differences. But don't confuse SOP, for example, with a policy manual. There's a difference, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. SOPs are used by pretty much everybody: the military, NASA, big companies, small companies. In this particular example, I call the company Pro American Service. So when you see Pro American Service, that's not a real company. That's a fictitious company. None of this information is about a real company, but it's also real SOP. It was just written so that you could change Pro American Service out with your company name. And in fact, this is SOP that I've been writing for clients for quite a while. So it is all real, but I've just simply put in a generic name calling the company Pro American Services. In the introduction, I talk about the difference between a policy and a procedure. So what is the difference? A policy is the rule. It's the law. When we have a policy that you get to work at 8 a.m., that's the rule. We might have a procedure for what you do to get here at 8 a.m. We might have a policy that says you have to collect on demand service when the terms are COD, and then we might write procedures and or workflows on how to collect that money. But the policy is the rule, and the procedure is the method by which you get that done. Some examples of policy: employee work hours, start time, end time, getting to work on time, not being late, when and how to complete a certain form or a document, or how and when to how and when to file a time off request or a request for vacation, what greeting to use when answering the phone, how and when to enter contact log notes. So the rule might be, thank you for calling Pro American Service. This is James. How may I help you? That's my rule. If that's the rule, then that's your policy. So policies are firm rules. What about procedures? A good procedure would be how to present service solutions in the field. You go ahead and make your diagnostics. You know what needs to be fixed. How do you present that to the client, the customer? That would be a procedure. It might be a policy or a rule that you have to present to the customer and get their approval, but the procedure would be best practices on how to get that done. Other procedures like talking points and strategies to use when responding to sales objections. How to explain certain features and how they work. How the company might consider using those features. Tips and guidelines to help you write an informative and SEO-friendly blog article could be a procedure. The rule, the policy is write an article every week, Saturday by midnight. The procedures would be how to do it. SOPs are absolutely critical for many reasons, one of which is consistency. And I think that was Ray Kroc's idea when he kind of made SOPs famous when he franchised McDonald's. It's really important to be consistent. You can be mediocre and consistent and have way better results than something that is great and not great and great and not great. There's a lot to be said for consistency. Also, until you put something in writing, it's hard to maintain it. When you put a system of policies and procedures into writing, well, now you can go back and tweak that document. When it's not working, you have one source of authority, one place to go update your SOP. It also can be a great training tool. When you hire someone, hand them the SOP. Not only do they get their employment policy manual and so forth, but you hand them the SOP for dispatching, using an app, bookkeeping, accounting. There are a lot of different formats for your SOP. There are no universal SOP formats that I've ever known. I researched it more before doing this presentation to see if something's changed, and I made a few notes in here. There's no universal standard. There's some widely received or followed standards, and I've listed those, but there really isn't any format out there that's official. A common format looks like this. It has a title page, a table of contents. It starts off with a purpose and a scope. There usually are definitions, some terminology, like you want to define certain terminology that's used that maybe people aren't familiar with. You then might have roles and responsibilities, procedure steps, and so forth. I'll show you an example of those. There's also the header information and properties that's really important that I outlined earlier. Before we get into an example SOP, I want to make a really important point about standard operating procedures. They are not how-to manuals. You and I might write an SOP for using the forklift. So we're going to write SOP on how and when and who and what product to move with that forklift. But we're not going to mention how to start the forklift. We're not going to mention where the steering wheel is or the throttle. We're going to assume that the driver is competent, that the forklift operator is competent, that they have been trained on that. So the SOP assumes the person knows how to use the product. It would assume that you know how to use QuickBooks. Let's say your company uses QuickBooks. The SOP does not get into training QuickBooks. There are documents for that, of course, but the SOP is not one of them. It assumes that you know how to find things, that you know how to operate the machine, the software, the product. So there's a big difference between SOP and the need for training. Here is an example SOP. It starts out with the title. I just simply called it Example Standard Operating Procedure. There should be an introduction quickly explaining what the SOP is about. And then you would want to have a title. And our title is Brewing a Cup of Coffee Using a Drip Coffee Maker. Okay, this is not a giant priority unless you like coffee as much as I do in the morning. Maybe you don't need to start with this, but writing an SOP for making coffee is a great example of the purpose of SOP. You want some kind of document ID number. Like, for example, I start with SOP and then ACC OF001. That's pretty arbitrary on how to do that, but a document ID is helpful when you go to search for that particular document. You'll want a version number, and you can have Microsoft Word add that version number for you automatically. The same with your last updated date. You could type that in manually or have Word do that. The effective date. When does this SOP become effective? You might be writing it today and it becomes effective on March 1st. You'll want that date. Also, what department does it apply to? It could be company-wide. It could be admin, service department. When it comes to who is supposed to brew the coffee, when, what coffee do we use, how strong to make it, when it comes to that, the department we would call admin, the administrative department. You also might want a table, like you see here, where we can keep track of approval and revision history. Now, Microsoft Word can be turned on to keep track of all the changes, so you don't have to be detailed here. You just need to put in the date, the version number, the prepared by, who did the editing, the changes made, something like initial release of SOP, and who approved it. This is important as well. Who is allowed to write SOP? It might be 7 people, 10 people. Who are allowed to approve SOP? Both the initial and the edits. That person's name would go there. So once I finish the SOP, I turn it over to the person who has to approve it, and that might be also me, so I put my name in there twice. If somebody revises the SOP, like Kathy Harder revised it, she corrected some minor typos. Heck, if I wrote it, there weren't minor typos. It was like, Kathy, it was correcting major typos. You're just being polite by putting minor in there. But she went in and corrected my typos. So she puts the date she finished that. We give it another version, like 1.1. And then who approved it? Me. So it might be that I have to approve all these changes. That'll depend on the department too. You might have a department manager that can approve these in one department, but not another. All right, after that, we start out with a purpose. We explain the purpose of the SOP. So in this case, and if I may, I'm just going to read it. This SOP outlines the step-by-step process of brewing a single pot of coffee using a drip coffee maker. It ensures consistency and prevents common mistakes that lead to bad coffee, like weak, too strong, bitter. The SOP was written for the Acme Express brewer, model AEB 500. Now, I made that up. I made the model up and all that, but you might have your coffee maker, your model on there as well. Again, it's not a user manual, but it might be a good idea to have the name of the machine. If the model doesn't matter, then it might just say coffee maker. It might just say forklift, copier, scanner, truck, whatever. The scope. What's the scope? This procedure is intended for anyone who needs to brew coffee using the model AEB 500 standard drip coffee maker, including first-time users. This SOP assumes the coffee maker has already been set up for use. So we're not getting into that. So already we have a purpose and a scope. Now we really know what this is about. We know if this pertains to us. Is it something that we need to pay attention to? What we're trying to do here is identify the who, what, and the when, and sometimes the why. I'm a big believer in explaining why we do things. I'm not willing to debate it in most cases. I'm willing to have open conversations about it, but this is not about getting them to do it. This is the rule, right? But it helps to know, why are we doing this? Why do we have a coffee SOP? Why do we even have a coffee maker? Well, people like to drink coffee. Schedule and responsibility. The company will provide a quality coffee maker, etc. A full pot of coffee will be made each morning at 8 a.m. during normal office hours. The receptionist shall be responsible for this task. This could be anybody. Just don't use names. Names change. Use titles. If somebody has the same title, then you might have a 1 and a 2 or assistant or something like that. But use titles rather than use names. I suppose you could use both, but just understand you always want to have a title because names can change. Also, and I don't just mean names can change because you might have somebody quit or you might fire them. I mean, they might be on vacation. So if the receptionist is on vacation and I'm the stand-in, so I'm covering his job or her job, well, then I know this pertains to me. So I need to be aware of the SOP for that particular job. If somebody says, hey, can you be the receptionist for a week, stand in for me? Sure, I will. One of the things I'm going to do is say, hand me your SOP. Schedule and responsibility makes all of that clear. I finished that part by saying other employees are welcome to make coffee as desired, but they must follow these rules or risk losing that procedure. So after that's done, we now know the who and the what and the when, and we know a little bit about the why. We can get into the actual procedures. And these I won't read for you, but you can see how it works. The procedure might be written out as like number 1 or step 1, check the coffee maker and supplies. And this is where we explain who's supposed to buy coffee. I know that the receptionist is supposed to brew the coffee. It's supposed to be ready at 8 a.m., right? 1 pot, not 2 or 3 or 5. I know that anyone can brew all the coffee they want as long as they follow these rules, but we don't know who's supposed to buy the coffee. This is where we lay all that out. So the company will assure that we have a good coffee maker, that we have coffee, we have filters, we have supplies. And then we talk about how to brew the coffee. Now, I did say earlier, this is not meant to be a user manual. And this kind of dives into that just a little bit. It kind of reads like a user manual. But what we're trying to do here is list the steps that are required for quality and consistency. Measure the coffee. How much coffee? So we wouldn't say put some coffee in there and close the lid, right? We might say, using a tablespoon provided, measure 1 tablespoon of ground coffee for every 6 ounces of water. If unsure, use the measurement lines on the carafe to estimate water volume. Example, 4 cups of coffee, 24 ounces, uses 4 tablespoons of ground coffee. I go on to say, always use fresh, clean, cool water, not hot water. Now, down here towards the bottom, we talk about who's supposed to turn the coffee maker off, who's supposed to clean it up, and then we might finish with tips for consistency. Also, perhaps some troubleshooting. If we're talking about a machine and not answering the phone, then we might have some troubleshooting tips for machines. We might also have frequently asked questions, if it was applicable. If you get a lot of questions on a particular workflow, then you would want to put in some FAQ. So what we have here is workflow, brewing coffee. It might be part of a larger workflow running the office. And we have a specific SOP for a very specific task, making coffee. After that, now that we've got our coffee, we're ready to answer the phone. We've got our coffee before 8 o'clock, the phone's no longer rolling. And when they ring, what do? That's the next SOP that I would write, is how to answer the phone. Now, what I thought I would do is skip to an SOP that I think is really important and cover that in a little bit more detail. If I keep scrolling, I will show you a little bit more about what we have here and the detail, so you can get an idea of the amount of detail that goes into it. Notice it might say something like select expense type or click a button, but it doesn't tell you all about how the button works. Again, it assumes you know those things already. So what I'm scrolling down to find, and just giving you a chance to look at the detail, is this: the scheduling and dispatching the demand service call. We talked about that before. Now, if it's helpful, what you would do is, rather than try to explain how to use the software that your company uses, you might link to software help topics like I've done. Click to open a help topic. So I know if I click that, I'm going to go out on the internet and I'll see a help topic on this. And that way, if I have questions about how the software works, then I can read that topic. Otherwise, this is not going to get into that. All right, so let me cover this in a little more detail. Objective: to provide clear and efficient steps for scheduling and dispatching demand service calls, ensuring all customer interactions and work orders are processed accurately and timely. Might have also, should have put, and consistently. Recommended setup: I get into this just briefly, but if it's really important, you want to just touch on it. Monitor setup: 2 monitors, if not 3. Now, the company typically is providing that, so when I sit down at my desk or my cube, I've got 3 monitors. I'm not expected to go running around trying to find those monitors. But it's important to get it into the SOP so that in the future, somebody reading this who's not as familiar with things understands that we want them to use 2 monitors. And why is more obvious in a moment. Procedures: customer verification. Answer the incoming call, greet the customer, and begin by searching for their information. How do you search? That should be a rule. We shouldn't just let people search any way they want. We want to be as efficient as possible. So once we figure out the most efficient way to search for the customer, we want to document that in our SOP. So for me, locate customer record. In the customer list on monitor 1, use the phone all or address fields to search for the customer. Verify their contact information to ensure it's current. So I find the customer, I open the record. Are you still at 8877 Bourgade? Is that street or avenue? 66219? I don't have an email. Would you like to give me an email? That kind of thing. Verify the information and capture any information that your company requires that doesn't exist. If it's a new customer setup, notice that I cover that. Work order creation. That's the next step. Open new work order form with the customer information verified or created from scratch. Begin a new work order. Again, we don't tell them how. If it's our software, they would know. They click menu, create work order, about 4 choices down. Then the work order opens. Confirm a service date and time. As you can see, this would work fine with paper. If you don't even have software, with just some modification, you could explain how to do this whole process with paper and no software in particular. Confirm a service date and time. Discuss availability with the customer. You have the customer list on one monitor. You have the schedule board on another. And you're looking at that schedule board as you're talking to them about a date and time that works for both parties. Match the technician's skill to the particular reason why the customer's calling. Make sure that if it's plumbing, we send a plumber. If it's HVAC, we send a qualified HVAC person. If it's a boiler, we want to be sure that that person can work on boilers. Number 3, or step 3, assign the tech. So we assign an appropriate technician. We set the status to dispatched. Now, in the old days, when we had a piece of paper, we just checked a little box. With software, you might click a button, right-click on something, but Now that you've assigned the technician and you have a date and a time, by definition, I would call that dispatched. Dispatched also might mean to you that we've informed the technician. So you might have a date, a time, and that's scheduled. When you assign the technician, you then might call that dispatched, or it may be dispatched, considered dispatched when you actually tell the technician about it. That's up in the air, but that's why we have SOP. Work order completion and invoicing. Technician invoice generation. The technician will complete the work order and create an invoice directly from it in the field. Whenever possible, the technician should collect payment upon job completion. They want to look at the terms to see if they are supposed to collect. Data entry and required fields. Complete all required fields. This is where you let them know what fields are absolutely required, such as marketing. Fields marked as required are necessary for accurate reporting and processing. If uncertain, select unknown in that selection box. So again, regardless of what software you have, or even if you have a form, a document, if they are required to check some boxes, such as how did you hear about us, marketing source, you should always have an unknown box so that we know you didn't forget it. When you check unknown, you can go back and collect that information later. Also, if we don't have an unknown in a software program especially, and we can't continue without a selection, what are they going to do? They're going to pick the wrong thing. They have to. If a field must be populated to move on, like to be able to hit the next button or the save button, and you don't know what value to pick, you're just going to pick any value. By picking unknown, you can tell people, don't be afraid to click unknown. You're not going to get in trouble. Let them know they're not going to get in trouble for clicking unknown. But that allows you to at least go back and know that it's unknown and you can get that information. And even if you never get that information, at least you don't report on it. You don't have to report on the unknown and have that mess up your results. Step 6, office review of mobile invoices. So when the invoice gets created in the field, the next step, after it's all said and done, is for the office to look at those invoices and make sure they comply with company standards. All right, so that was pretty brief, right? The SOP was fairly brief. It was just laying out the rules. I did mention the technician has to create a work order or create an invoice from the work order. They have to collect. That comes into another SOP. So here we have the SOP for the technician, managing a work order and creating an invoice in Aptora Mobile 2. Now, if you own our software and you use the app, I'm happy to share this with you. I'll have a coworker put it on Aptora Pros. But this would lay out probably 80% of what you want to do in your company. You would just have to change those things that you do differently. All right, so let's cover this one. This one's really important in my opinion. Managing a work order and creating an invoice. So I know what it does. Mobile user setup. I don't get into it right now. That would be its own SOP. But we first talk about how management has to set up the mobile app for this technician. They go in and set up the preferences, permissions, settings, styles, templates, etc. Process for the technicians. This process is for service and maintenance technicians. Installers follow a different process. If you are an installer, please see the appropriate SOP. So we're telling them the who, so they know this is service and maintenance technicians. First of all, log into Aptora Mobile 2. You've been assigned a username, a password, log in. The next thing, once you log in, open the work order and begin travel. Again, notice that it doesn't read like a user manual. We leave most, if not all of that out because we assume that they know where to find their work order list. From the home page, click My Work Orders. Carefully locate the next work order that you should be working on. Tap the work order to open it. Look at the details of the work order. If necessary, click on the address to open a map for location and directions. Tap the phone number if you need to call the customer prior to going out. When you are ready to begin the drive, tap the En route button. They should know about the En route button. They know where it is. You could make a note that it should be top left, but they should know that. So now they're en route, driving out there. Arrival and diagnostics. Now that they've arrived, they've parked their truck, move on to arrival and diagnostics. When you arrive at the location, tap the working button. You are now finished with the app until you have determined the work that needs to be done. So it doesn't matter what you're using, you're finished with the app at that moment. The only thing you've done is tapped, a few buttons. When you have determined the absolutely required repairs, the repairs that are needed to address the problem described by the customer, the reason why they called you, click the Items tab. From the Items tab, click the Add Services button, and if you don't see that button, click the Add Items button. That's because some companies choose not to have the Add Services button, so I covered both. You would be more precise because you would know which one they would click. I talk about searching for the flat rate tasks, adding them, and now we're ready to present the solution. The last thing that they add is a subtotal, and that subtotal part number is absolutely required. That's the number they'll find. The item will subtotal all of the work they're proposing, and it will identify it through a label on the item, absolutely required repairs. So the first thing that the SOP, the big point this SOP is making, is we present absolutely required repairs first. That's our SOP. Yours may be different. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying that that's the importance of this SOP. So when you're ready to present, you click the hamburger button, tap the print preview, verify that the pricing and details are correct, and then explain your recommendations according to the company policy. The last thing you want to say is this: once I complete my work, I will run your system for about 10 minutes or so. I'm in no hurry. I will make sure that everything else is working properly. If I detect anything else that requires attention, I will be sure to tell you about it. Nothing else happens without your approval. So if you don't have any questions, I'll go ahead and get to work. That's what we want them to say. They can say anything you want, but this is where you write it down. You really want to control this process as much as you can. Remember, we still need to train them. They need to know what is absolutely required. How do they say it? How do they position themselves, etc. So this is also not a substitute for the training that's required to be able to follow this SOP. You think about football for a minute with the Super Bowl coming up. Think about football. The policy might be to throw the ball. That's the policy. I'm telling you to throw it. I tell you what play to run. But we've already trained on running the play. So that we've already had our training. We know how to conduct the game of football. The strategy is the play. And the rule is you're going to run play number 1, 2, 3. So we still have training to think about. Now, depending on your company policy, you might have a pre-authorization signature, software or paper. You go back to the days of paper, you might have gotten that piece of paper signed. You talk about that. Once the work is done, carefully test the system to determine if other important work is needed, any other recommendations, etc. You repeat the process as outlined earlier until all the work is completed. If additional work is recommended, follow the steps in the present your initial solution absolutely required. Otherwise, you can skip that section. So actually, I wrote the wrong thing there. What I meant to say is you could skip this. All right, so we've done the initial work. Let's say that they called because they had no heat last night. We came out to the home and discovered that the heat pump condensing unit fan motor had failed. and we told them your fan motor failed. It's X number of dollars. May I go ahead with that? Yeah, I guess we got to get it done. Wow, that's a ton of money. Gosh, that's expensive. Well, the richer they are, the more they complain about the price. We all know that, right? So just let them talk and don't try to interrupt them. Just let them say that, because they'll just move on to, yes, I guess we have to do it. Now, you go do the work. As you already mentioned to them, once you do that work, you're going to run the system, because you haven't been able to run the system up until now, and you're going to evaluate it. And if anything else needs to be addressed, you've told them that you're going to come talk to them about it. So that process repeats itself. Let's say that it was low on refrigerant or something to that effect. Now, the last thing you want to do is give your final recommendations. We call those highly recommended. So we have recommendations that are absolutely necessary to get the system running. Now that I have it running, I'd like to get it running better. So to put the system back as close as I possibly can to factory specifications in terms of capacity, efficiency, reliability, peace of mind. These are the things that I'd like to do. And that might involve cleaning the evaporator coil, cleaning the condensing coil. It might be reworking some duct, something like that. That's the final part of your work order. Now, again, we've trained them on the importance of this, how to do it, what to say. The SOP just gives them the step-by-step so that if they forget any of it, they can take a look at it. Finalize the work order with detailed service notes. Now that you're finished with all the work, it's time to document everything that you have said to them. You may manually type in all of these notes, so I'm giving them the option. They could also use voice to text, right? So they could just speak into their mobile device. And they could also select something from the pre-written service descriptions that you might provide them. You might provide them with a large list of service descriptions that they can select from and auto-populate the text box on their work order. Either way, you're giving them the options. Now, if you do want to pre-write those service notes, then you want to make sure that you have those available. Let me just show you mine real quick.
James, someone is wondering if the sample document will be shared.
I will share a version of this document. I don't want to share every bit of it because I've written a lot of these things and I'm addressing a question that was online. I don't want to share the entire document because I write these things for my clients that I work with, and wouldn't be fair to just give the whole thing away. But what I will do is I'll give away the beginning, the coffee maker template, and the work order in mobile. So processing the work order, the invoice in mobile, then everybody can have that as well. And that should give you the basic framework to write these any way you want to. All right, so what I was talking about is the pre-written descriptions. As part of your entire operations manual, so the operations manual is everything about running your company. As part of that, you would want to write those descriptions that the SOP mentions. If the SOP mentions something like a document, then you write that document and provide a link to it. So I will show you my pre-written descriptions. Where are you? Let's see. Here you are. All right, so these are HVAC descriptions. I haven't gotten around to creating many for plumbing. I have some for electrical. Again, I do an introduction, explain what this is about. And then here I talk about the service repair, diagnostics, and flat rate pricing presentation. I talk about the absolutely required repairs. What do I mean by that? What are my objectives? So absolutely required repairs. Your initial diagnosis and recommendation are designed to accomplish these objectives. Get the system operational, addressing the client's original concern, no heat. Make certain that the entire system is absolutely safe to operate. This is non-negotiable. So if we're working on a gas-fired appliance, we have to make sure it's safe. It doesn't matter why they called us. We have to make sure it's safe, and we charge them for that if we have to, but that's non-negotiable. If they don't like it, if they don't want to pay for it, then we move on to somebody that wants to be safe. That is non-negotiable. That is in your company's policy manual, the rules of your company. Number 3, place the system in a condition so that it should run approximately a year without requiring other repairs. Now, it's hard to guarantee that, and we don't guarantee it. But what we do is we say to technicians and customers, we want to do everything we can to make sure that we're not coming back in a week, a day, a month, because that's not good for anybody. We're not trying to make it perfect, but we want to address issues that would have us back and inconvenience you down the road. So we're looking for about a year. If I'm working on that gas furnace, I want to get through the heating season. If I'm working on a heat pump that provides heating and cooling, of course, I want to get through 2 seasons, so there's a year. Number 4, this work will be written out as required repairs. We recommend that this amount be subtotaled on the invoice or the work order. Highly recommended services. Here's where we explain that. Get the system back to the manufacturer's original efficiency rating and capacity as is reasonably possible. Number 2, put the system in a state of condition so that it will likely run for several more years with nothing more than routine maintenance. Address any indoor air quality or comfort issues that you have or that the client has mentioned. So issues that you see. Of course, you're not doing the work without their permission. You're just addressing those with them. This work will be written out as highly recommended services. So what this document is doing is it's providing you with a framework for training. It's not the SOP. It gets into more details, and it's the document you hand the technician before they ever see an SOP. That way, when they read the SOP, they understand what this meant. All right, so here are the pre-written descriptions. I have, for example, motors and capacitors, furnace motor replacement. I have condensing unit motor replacements. And that's a pretty good description. What we want to do is we want to avoid using specifications like horsepower. We don't want to put half horsepower, 115 volts, 30 amps, that kind of thing. That way we don't have to change those specs. We want to be a bit wordy because we're trying to create value. We want to be sure to explain how much we actually did, but we don't want to get so specific that the technician has to change this. It'd be nice if they could just hit a button and have it populate. Condensing unit fan motor replacement number 2. So we give a couple options depending on what they're doing. Furnace or air handler motor replacement. Then we have a description of a replace run capacitor. You're probably thinking, I've got a description. It's replace capacitor, right? Oh, imagine if you took the money and divided it by 2 words, replace capacitor or replace cap or replace run cap. Chances are they're paying a lot of money per word, right? So we want to explain how we arrived at diagnosing a bad capacitor. What does the capacitor do? What's it mean? What do we do now? You don't expect technicians to write all this out. That's why it's important to write it out for them. Now, in the old days, as you get older, you say the old days a lot more like I'm doing. In the old days, when I ran an HVAC company as an owner, operator, running service, we wrote all these out on paper and put them in a 3-ring binder. We didn't have the benefit of software early on when we came up with this idea, but a lot of this was written out in advance so that they could just copy from those documents. Now with software, you can make it easy. Replace motor starting capacitor. So we have a run capacitor, we have a starting capacitor. How about start gear, motor starting gear? There's an explanation of that. Electrical controls and wiring. So in this section, we have replace safety pressure switch, not replace switch or pressure switch. It's replace safety pressure switch, and we talk about it. Replace electrical contactor, replace electrical relay, minor wiring repair, reset a breaker. Now, look at this one. Flipping a breaker back on. That's one of the biggest creations of callbacks there is. Flipping on a breaker, replacing a fuse. So there's a lot to say about flipping on a breaker, isn't there? But a lot of it is explaining to the technician the standards by which we expect them to comply with, but we're also trying to explain to the customer why we didn't replace the breaker, why it could have tripped, and resetting it was the proper solution. In many cases, it wasn't, right? It needs to be replaced. So we have a replace the breaker. Again, at the risk of repeating myself over and over again, this isn't the time for training. This lays the framework for training, but I would hand this to the technicians and I would hold up a breaker and we would talk about the construction of a breaker and how a breaker trips and how a breaker that trips over and over again becomes weak. It loses its ampacity. We would talk about the difference between a switching breaker, one meant to be switched on and off like you'd find in a disconnect, and a breaker that wasn't meant to be messed with by the homeowner every winter or whenever. And we talk about how that affects the breaker's ampacity. So that's training. That's done at another time. This is the framework for it. Replace a fuse. Replace the thermostat. We also have an extender for the Wi-Fi thermostat. So we have a description for the thermostat, and then they can backspace over that part if it doesn't apply. So you might have a thermostat that needed to be connected to the network, Wi-Fi, and we would want to mention that. Gas heating repairs. So we cover gas valves, replace the flue gas inducer motor, not just the draft inducer, draft motor. Again, you want to get wordy. You're not being silly, but you want to get wordy because you need to explain why they invested so much money in that work. Replace a fan switch, replace a safety high limit switch, replace a pilot igniter, gas pipe fitting. Professional recommendations. So in this section, you might write out what are the professional recommendations that we could be offering. Well, we might offer a whole house humidification system. And there's the copy paste. A whole house air filtration system. Maybe a UV air treatment system. Maybe a programmable thermostat. Maybe coil cleaning. We recommend cleaning the evaporator, cleaning the condensing coil. Just pop that in there. And then finally, warnings and important notices. I only have one here. I could add more and should eventually, but I did the most important. What if we encounter a compromised heat exchanger? Even if it's not leaking because there's a draft inducer creating the proper pressures, we need to be very careful about warning our clients, our customers about that serious condition. So rather than leave it to chance, I want to tell them exactly what to say, what to write, and they would just pop that in to their description. So that would be a company-approved, well thought out description of this situation. And your SOP would talk about red tagging. So this mentions red tagging, but your SOP would talk about adding this, red tagging the appliance, flipping off the breaker in the breaker panel. If it's dedicated, the SOP would say, if it's a dedicated breaker, turn it off. If there's a switch, and there should be on the side, then flip it off. Maybe take a piece of red electrical tape and put the tape over the switch. Maybe put the tape over the breaker. If you think that's a good idea, then you would mention it during training, but you'd also put it in the SOP. The SOP would mention that. And that gives you the consistency that you're looking for, but it also gives better customer service when followed you have better customer service because they're following this system. If you've ever gone into a restaurant like Chick-fil-A, one thing I noticed about Chick-fil-A, they're really nice people. They hire really nice kids. But I would imagine that being nice is also part of the training. It's part of the rules. You have to be nice. But they wouldn't just say, be nice. They would say, begin your sentence with the following. End your sentences with the following. Greet people in the following way, so that even if they were going through the motions, as long as they didn't look angry, they would at least sound nice, right? So you could be talking to a kid that's not nice, but you comment to your husband or wife, well, that kid was very nice. It could be just because of the things they said, and it wasn't left to chance. The company designed all that verbiage to come across as a nice person. All right, so that is a document that complements your SOP. Your SOP mentioned management needs to set this up. This document covers that. All right, let's go back to the SOP for the technician in the field. And this is one of the longest SOPs, by the way, because it is one of the most important, and we want to orchestrate this system carefully, this workflow carefully. Now you have the work order completed, and I mentioned that if it's commercial work, pay particular attention to the work order because you may not be creating an invoice. If it's commercial work, you might be expected to get a signature and you leave. You might be expected to get a signature and then email corporate the work order, or the office creates an invoice and sends it. Or you may create the invoice and send it to corporate. You have to mention all of those things in your SOP, and if you're using software, then you have to tell them what fields to look at in order to know what to do. I'm going to say that this demand service call is a COD. We're supposed to collect. Typical residential scenario, that's probably what you do. So we tell them to move to the step number 8, create the invoice from the work order. Tap the hamburger menu and click Create Invoice. Check the Include Items option and uncheck the option to complete the work order. Again, they should know what that is. This is just a reminder to make sure they do it. Remind the customer of the total amount due and ask them what form of payment they would like to use. I would add the quote to put in there, how to ask, and I should do that myself because I'm picky about it. What method of payment would you like to use? That's what I want them to say. I also want them to say, your total investment is $459.32. I don't want them to say the price of this is $459.98. I want them to say your total investment is, and use words and not numbers. $482.91. So I always say the 482 with a pause. 91. 482.91. So I'm de-emphasizing, the big number. But I also want to put in my SOP and make part of my training that I want to emphasize the discount. Your total investment is $494.52. Oh, by the way, I forgot to ask you, do you own one of our safety and efficiency agreements? Oh, you don't? Yeah, safety and efficiency? No, you don't? Okay. I just wanted to see if you qualified for the $55 discount. So you would emphasize the discount, you de-emphasize the total investment, the price. All right, so we talk about that. It goes into our training, but we briefly mention that in the SOP. Remind the customer of the amount, ask them what method of payment they would like to use. If it is a credit card, then you mention what button to click. If it's a check, you mention what button to click. If you need to get a signature, you mention that. So in mine, it says click the hamburger button and select the capture signature. Hand the mobile device to the customer. Ask them to sign in the box provided and type in their name in the name field. When the mobile device is handed back to you, verify that you have a signature and a printed name. Enter their printed name. Don't give it back to them. Enter their printed name if needed. be sure you had their full name and that it's correctly spelled. Like, I'm James Leichter. How do you spell that, right? I know the James, I think, but how do you, Leichter? So you make sure you have that correct. Receive one or more payments on the invoice. If the customer is using a credit card, do this. If they're using a check, do that. What if they pay in cash? Do you even allow cash? Well, you probably don't want to. The office has probably already talked to them about that, but you should have a procedure for cash. You should mention that it goes into the zippered bank deposit bag provided in the vehicle, or maybe you have a drop box in the vehicle that's locked and you put the money in there, but mention that in your SOP. Email the invoice. What if they don't want to get an email from you? There are some people out there, not many, thankfully, but there's people out there that say, I don't get on the line. I don't do the internet thing. You'll have to send me a paper copy. Well, if they do that, then what do we do? What's the procedure? So like in our software, there's a to be printed button. They tick that button to yes, and the office then knows that that needs to be printed. And that's how it works. So they just have to tick that button. Otherwise, most of the time, they'll follow the email procedure. They'll create the PDF, send an email. It's just one button to click, and your SOP talks about that. Tap the home button, so you're all done. You've emailed it to them, and you're ready to go. You then tap the home button as you're walking out to your vehicle. You get into your vehicle, maybe that's when you tap the home button, but you go back to the home button, you go back to the home screen by tapping the home button, lower left, and you will notice a notification at the top that work order X number, XYZ, numbered XYZ is opened. And in our program, you won't be able to take another work order. You can't accept the next work order until you manage it. So you'll click that, it opens up the work order, and you click the stop button. The app will then ask you, are you sure you want to stop this timesheet entry? Yes, you are sure. And it will offer you the option of completing the work order, and that's when you complete the work order. So the work order gets completed when you're in your vehicle, your tools are all put away, and there's nothing left but to put the truck into drive and go to your next call. So that allows you then to see the next work order. You can lift the next work order and repeat the process. And that's what we tell them in step number 10, repeat the process for your next work order. Just be careful. If you're looking at more than one work order, just be double careful to make sure you're going on the next one and not one after that. And then finally log out. Now, I like to end with notes where I need to say things or emphasize things, but I didn't want to ruin the flow of the procedures in the SOP. So rather than get into a bunch of rabbit holes, if and that, and in case of the other thing, I like to finish with notes or tips. So I can say, for example, in this context, a task is a group item in case they need to know that. A group item in our software is made up of 2 or more items grouped into one. Same with QuickBooks, they have group items. Most every program has a group item, so it's not a bad idea to mention what that is because they were searching for flat rate tasks. Well, now they know that's just a group item. We may use service items as flat rate tasks. So in my world, I use service items as flat rate tasks also. So I use group items and I also use service items. If the customer is not present to sign the work order and or invoice, sign your own name and enter verbal approval by their name in the print name box. So you're not there. Now, according to company policy, I need to get your approval. Let's pretend like this is the policy. So I call you, I text you, whatever. I scream down the street, whatever it takes, but I get the approval from James Leichter. Now what do? He's not here to sign. I sign for him and print by entering the text, verbal approval, email approval, phone approval, whatever it was, by James Leichter in the print box, print name box. Now, why do I do that? Well, first of all, This makes it clear that I did not forget to get the signature. I just couldn't. Secondly, in our program, anyway, I can prevent certain things from happening until there's a signature. So if you don't get a signature, you couldn't proceed. And I want to make it okay. I want you to know it's okay to sign your own name and not to just put gibberish in there so you can get to the next screen. Finally, when you do sign in our software, it enters their geolocation information into the database. So we stamp that information into the database. We even have a little map of it, but we put in the latitude and longitude, the date, the time, etc., time zone. We know all that, and that could come in handy should someone challenge you on whether or not you were ever out there and did the work. So if the GPS data shows that you were in the middle of a warehouse, which is a true story, client went to small claims court, person said, I never authorized it. I never told them to come out. I don't know what they're talking about, because he got in a lot of trouble with his manager for a big repair. But anyway, in small claims court, they just demonstrated through the GPS data, their software provider being Aptora, the GPS data showed them in the middle of the warehouse. You know, the judge, that's all the judge needed to hear. How did they get into the middle of the warehouse if nobody invited them in there, right? Unlikely. So that is our SOP on the work order and creating the invoice. Let's go back up to the top and revisit something that was in here. I said each mobile user must be first added to Total Ops Manager or Aptora 360 as a user. They do not need any software permissions for the desktop program. They only need a username and password. That's where they get it. The Aptora Mobile 2 app, in that app, you need to add the terms, conditions, preferences, display settings, work order descriptions, etc. So we don't get into that in too much detail because, again, that's part of training, and that might be a different SOP. It's just there to mention that that's important. If they're a new employee and haven't been set up, it reminds everybody, oh, I got to set you up. So I'm handing the SOP to the tech, and I'd go, oh, hang on, I got to set you up. I got to get you set up in there first. Now, how do we set them up? Then, that would be another SOP. So here's an example of that. Underneath this SOP, and it could be a separate document, I have required settings and permissions. Common permissions, settings for techs. For a typical company with typical mobile users working as service and maintenance technicians, the following are very common settings in permissions found in the permission screen. Be sure to test all your permissions and settings. So you really want to set up one tech and run through that process. Make sure that they can get to every button, every report, every form, and they can't get to things you don't want them to get to, and the app is behaving correctly. Once you have one technician set up, then you can copy their permissions to the other techs very quickly. And we're going to even make it even quicker. If you own our software and you've always wanted more of a wizard to update lots of people with even fewer clicks, we're in the process of doing that. So what are those settings? Well, just cover them. Make them the company rule. So here's a rule, a company rule. I've already said in the SOP, go do it, but do what? This is where we lay out the rule. So log in, well, that's required. Load calculator, yeah, I'm going to let them see the load calculator. You may say, no way, I don't want them looking at that load calculator. That's fine. Don't give them the ability to go to the list and edit one. Mobile invoices, list, edit, add, view. Check those. You really need those, trust me. My inventory, my timesheets, my work orders, purchase orders. Do you want them to create purchase orders? Then give them list, edit, and add. Check those boxes. So one thing I skipped is, if you're wondering why it says like equal list, equal add, edit, up here at the top, I mentioned that those are columns and you're checking the box. So you're checking the box that intersects the row my inventory with the column list. You're checking that box. And there's the rest of them to check. Then we have a series of flip switches. Your software could be different, But after you get done checking all those boxes, then there's a series of flip switches. Yes, yes, no, no, no. We don't need to talk about the no's, so I just talk about the yes. Flip switch settings marked as yes. Under customer, flip that one to yes. Under document, flip it to yes. Under estimate, flip it to yes, etc. So we're going through each and every one of those. And then settings, those were permissions. We also have various settings, terms and conditions, and the style of this, and this format, and what screens look a certain way. So we talk about the required settings. Work order authorization. When you have them sign a work order, do you want any words to be on that work order? Like in the paper days, when you signed, it probably said, I hereby authorize the following work. And there's going to be a mechanic's lien if I don't pay, that kind of thing. Well, work orders have different terms than invoices. On a work order, I want to be sure that it's clear they authorized the work in the work order, right? That's why it's a work order. So I have work order authorization granted, that's part of it. And then there's the text. So there's nothing to chance here. The company's official verbiage is here. It goes into all the work orders. And what about invoices? Well, I've already authorized the work. I signed the work order. Now I've been presented with the price. I said yes, and I'm ready to pay you. This is to acknowledge very clearly and without any doubt that I was okay with the money, and I said go ahead with the money part. Charge me. So that's the invoice acceptance. And then we have basic terms and conditions for like collecting money, and we might have a notice of possible mechanic's lien. Now again, how did we get here? Well, we mentioned in our SOP that management needs to set up the mobile user, again, regardless of what software you're using or no software at all. You're just using paper. You need to have official terms and conditions, acceptance clauses, etc. You need to make that official. That's what we put in this document. Now it's official. All right. So if you're a sports fan, football, this is the playbook, isn't it? This is that playbook. We take a piece out of the playbook. The head coach laminates those sheets. Looks like they highlight a bunch of stuff. Well, that's part of the major playbook. You know, there's a bigger playbook somewhere, but they took the plays out that they wanted to run for this game, and they call them into the quarterback. The quarterback's already been trained on running the play. The whole team has been trained on running all these plays. But that play is your step-by-step SOP. All right. So after that one, we have other ones. We just keep going with the most important, like managing sales leads and marketing efforts. How do we deal with a sales lead? What's the workflow, etc. Another thing I want to show you, and we're going to wrap this up here in just a few moments. One thing I want to show you is for you total office manager owners, but if you don't have our software, this could apply to your program. In our software, let me drag it over here. In our software, we have under company, under lists, we have something called a stage list. And there's things like this elsewhere. I'm just picking on this one. Stages are individual elements of work. So we want to have different stages of things we do. Let me make this, let me resize this here for us real quick. I'm on a smaller screen than I was in my office. All right, there we go. So what you're seeing here are a bunch of stages that apply to various things. Like, for example, I have a stage in here, management approves estimate. The estimate will be reviewed for pricing, markup, discounts, terms, conditions, and other details. Set the estimate status to pending. And where do I want that to appear? I want it to appear in the estimate. Now, in a future update, we've actually separated the estimates from the invoices. Right now, they're combined, so they would appear in both places, but soon those will be separate. It just became apparent to me that they needed to be separate for some SOP that I was creating. But this is part of your SOP, like obtain signature and down payment. Invoice has been created. Create invoices from the estimate. Add additional reimbursables as needed. Using the pick ticket, remove the items that were not needed and add items that were used. Now that sounds a lot like SOP, doesn't it? It is. In the SOP, it might say that exact same thing, but I have a feature in Total Office Manager that allows me to recreate the SOP, and then you can pick from a list as you progress through the SOP. I'll give you another example. Create detailed estimate. Prepare a detailed estimate with all necessary labor, materials, and costs to present an accurate proposal to the customer. Set the estimate status to none. So status is now none. And then, well, what comes after that? Let's sort these. That was number 2. Number 4, I like to go in twos. Check prices for availability. Call suppliers to get the best prices and check for availability and possible ship dates. What comes next? Number 6. Obtain management approval of the estimate if required. Submit the estimate for management review and approval before presenting to the customer. Then the management approves it or denies it. They could deny it, but they could approve it and just edit it. The estimate will be reviewed for pricing, markup, etc. We saw that earlier. It's now been approved, and they can move on to the next one. Present estimate to the prospect. If they don't make the sale, then they are now in the sales follow-up motion. And if it's not awarded, so they said, no, I don't want this job. Get out of my house. Get out of this building. All right, so the estimate is not awarded. You'd stop here. The customer did not accept the estimate. Close the opportunity and document the reason for future reference. Set the estimate status to not awarded. All right. Now, where does that appear? If you open up your estimate, and not all of these were for an estimate, as you probably noticed when I was opening them up, some of them were for other things like work orders, purchase orders, etc. But here I am in an estimate, and I'm going to, create it. I click the stages, and there they are. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and I keep going. Now, what if I have obtain management approval for the estimate? Well, I can go to preferences, and I can go into security. Where are you, security? There you are. And I can turn on the approval process. So I can say require approval to print and email sales, invoices, estimates, credits, purchase orders, and even have a certain amount of money. So if it's over $10,000, over $5,000, etc. And then when I go back to my user security, you'll notice on this screen, I can allow them to be part of the approval process. So meaning I'm subjecting them to the approval process. And then I can even make them a person that can approve documents. So they can approve sales and invoices, estimates, credits, purchase orders, and there's their special password to do that. So in addition to their regular password, they have a special password to do that. That way, if it gets revealed, if they have to give the password to somebody because they can't do it, then we can always just change that. They don't have to change their user password, so no big risk there. But that is part of your company's policy, your SOP. You're talking to them about how to do this. The setup is then kind of like the user manual that's not part of the SOP. The setup talks about how to set up your software for this or your manual system for this. You might go on to show them, or at least just say it to them, part of the setup process, add a filter to the estimate list to show you estimates pending approval. And then the other person could set up a filter where they've been approved. So the only thing I have to do is open my list, hit my filter, and I can see purchase orders that are pending approval, estimates that are pending approval, whatever, pending approval. If I'm the person waiting on approval, I've got a button that shows me waiting on approval. I've got another button that shows me the ones that have been approved, and I can continue on with my process. So use the stage list to help you or complement your SOP. And again, that depends on, your software, but it was just the same way with a manual system. SOP doesn't really change because you have software. Software just makes it easier to do all this, and there's hopefully never any double entry. There certainly is not with ours. All right, so going back to my SOP, let me show you a complementary document. All right, so those stages that we just saw for estimates, there were some for work orders and POs. I didn't go into them. Where did they come from? Well, we wrote a document. We just started Microsoft Word because it's easier to think about what you're doing. And this would help you write your SOP. When you go to create an estimate, what's the first thing you do? Assuming the person knows how to use the software, what's the first thing they do? And then you can see I've written out each one of those steps. Present it, follow up, not awarded, stop here. It was awarded, proceed to the next stage, set your estimate status to awarded, obtain a signature and a down payment, confirm schedule with client, job ready for parts acquisition and scheduling, the job's approved. We have signatures, down payments, material procurement and scheduling can begin. Warehouse and scheduling departments have been notified. Again, using filters, they can see this. Inform the warehouse and scheduling teams so they can begin processing materials and workforce allocation, creating work orders, ordering parts, etc. Create the work orders, generate work orders with job details, assign technicians, required materials, and assigned equipment, if applicable, like do we need a pipe threading machine, a genie lift, the 40-foot ladder. Print pick tickets. Print a pick ticket listing the materials needed for the job so the warehouse staff can pull items. So you're pulling everything that you need for the job. You pull the items from inventory. You retrieve the job and materials from inventory and stage them for technician pickup. Make notes of what were pulled. Of course, you may not have everything you need, so now you're going to create purchase orders for the remaining items. You're going to receive the items. You're going to enter an item receipt, and it just goes on. Now, once you've done that in Word, you get to spell check it and read it and think about it and come back to it and rearrange stuff. Keep your descriptions under 250 characters, and then you can just paste those into Total Office Manager or your software if you have software that can do this. If you don't have software that can do this, then just turn this into a checklist. So you could just come in here and highlight these, and then you could go up to your toolbar, pick a box. If you don't like them over there, then do that. And now you've made a checklist. So make the whole thing into a checklist and hit the print button. And they have to check these. And then when he gets to a certain point, he might have to turn this checklist over to somebody else who then checks a couple of things and gives it back. So it can be done manually as well. Software, again, just makes it a little bit easier. But I do recommend writing these things up in stages. And what that allows you to do then is populate your software, but it also lays the groundwork for your SOP. This is your SOP. It's just presented in a slightly different way when we use that template that I showed you earlier. All right, so I think that pretty well wraps up the important parts of your standard operating procedure. Just to be clear, we have things like an employment policy manual, which tells you pretty much how to do nothing, but it just lays out the rules. And then we have training to tell you where to find the time off request, how to fill it out, etc. Your SOPs are the exact steps on doing those things. And that's really the difference between the SOP and the other manuals. All of these things collectively go into your operations manual. So your operations manual is a big binder or a cardboard box maybe, but your operations manual has all of these things in it. All of your policy manuals, your job descriptions, the job application people fill out, the questions you ask during the interview, the SOP, supporting documents, it goes on and on. Even your company's chart of accounts are part of an SOP, and I'll end with this. If I were setting up your bookkeeping from scratch, and you said, hey, we bought this software, set up our bookkeeping, well, then the most important thing that I would start with is your chart of accounts and your department list. But I shouldn't be able to just make that stuff up as I go along, right? So we need a policy on that. Well, the policy would include, remember, we have an SOP, do this, do that, then do this. But do what? What's the rule? Well, we have a chart of accounts list. So this is the chart of accounts that you use. These are the numbers you use. And that's just how it is. And if you want to do it differently, well, then you have to get permission. So here's a better look at it. That shows the hierarchy. The other one was ready to import. This is the hierarchy. You'll notice that every account has been explained. And this, by the way, has nothing to do with our software. Any software you would do this. You have the account name, but you're explaining what it is. You have rules for numbering. So these are your numbering conventions. Bank accounts, credit cards, expenses. Within expenses, you have marketing, employee related, building and equipment, vehicle related, administrative. These are the number conventions to use. And then we have departments. The next important thing to set up are your departments. Here they are. We have all of our departments. We have the hierarchy. So these are our divisions, our departments. We have a pricing method. How do you price each of these departments? Currently, it might just be one person and they know it all, but that can't continue, right? You want to become unnecessary but nice to have around, right? So when it comes to pricing residential demand service, how do you price it? Use pricing method number 3. Well, what is that? Go to the document. There's another document that shows you. Well, what if we get a commercial design build job? That's pricing method number 5. What's design build anyway? Well, we design the system and build it using inside engineering. How's that different than specs? Well, in spec you use pricing method number 5, but it's the following. What about plumbing demand service? What about sewer and drain cleaning, etc.? So that's a great opportunity to show how you want your departments to be formed and used, the pricing methods, the description of the department, chart of accounts. Again, this is all just part of your operations manual. What's your SOP? Your SOP is what happens if you think you need to add a chart of account. The SOP is, what do you do? Do you get to enter it, or do you have to get approval? Who do you get approval from? Remember, we don't have a name, we have a title. You get approval from the CFO, from the controller, from the head bookkeeper, etc. All right, that's it. Do we have any questions about any of the things we talked about today? No? So I'll be posting, again, to address that question earlier, I'll be posting an example of the SOP so that you can use it for your own needs. It'll have all of the instructions that you saw in the beginning, the who, the why, and the couple of examples of the SOP I'll have in there. Some of it, as I mentioned, I'm going to remove because I consider it proprietary for clients I'm working with. But it will have all the rules, the framework, and how to do it yourself. And the mobile should be really good for all of you. Even if you don't use our software, the mobile SOP, I'll include that because I think that will apply to pretty much any app you're using with just a little bit of work. All right, I want to say thank you for being here. I appreciate your time. I know it was long, a lot to talk about with SOPs. I know it can be a little bit boring, but I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think it was crucial. So on behalf of Alicia and Will that are behind the camera, making all this possible, I want to say thank you to them, and all of us at Aptora. I want to thank you for being our customers. We love you and appreciate you and wouldn't be here without you. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon.